Osama bin Laden, the former head of al-Qaeda, was known as Geronimo by US soldiers because he was so obstinate and difficult to track down, which speaks to the lasting impact of the Apache people and their legendary leader. He Geronimo, yell famously shouted by people when leaping from airplanes, is named after Geronimo. Various Native American tribes in North America are collectively known as the Apache, a powerful and iconic American Indian group that included the Chiricahuas, Jicarilla, Western Apache, Kiowa, Mescalero, and Lipan, with Hollywood westerns helping to make their name famous around the world. Most likely, the Spanish word Apache came from the Zuni words Apache or Apachu, meaning enemy. And similarly, the names of many indigenous communities we know today are distorted versions of their original names. The arrival of European settlers was the catalyst for the creation of labels like Apache. And to keep this section brief, we won't dive into the details of each tribe individually. Some believe the Navajo are actually related to the Apache, although opinions vary because the definition of Apache itself has always been somewhat vague. If the real names of these groups, like Sagatagenne and Intugenne, seem hard to remember, imagine what it must have been like for people from the Old World arriving on a brand new continent. Their minds must have felt like they had stumbled into a Twilight Zone episode. The fierce and determined residents may have been driven away by the radically different newcomers. Today, many have forgotten the fascinating history of the several Apache tribes that once thrived in the American Southwest. Originally, most of these indigenous peoples lived in the northern plains during prehistoric times. Anthropological evidence suggests that between the 13th and 15th centuries, they migrated southward from the northwest Pacific coast, choosing to settle on the southern plains of Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, rather than remaining in the canyon lands as they traveled east. At some point after this migration, the Apache split into two distinct groups, the eastern and the western tribes, and this division may have been influenced by the influx of new people into their communities, gradually changing their genetic makeup. Others believe that the differences had always existed, leading to the formation of many distinct groups over time. These communities spoke languages from the Athabascan family which may have either started out distinct or evolved later, and by tracing these language patterns, which span the north, the Pacific coast, and the southwest, historians have been able to map the migrations of the Apache peoples. Thanks to renewed interest in indigenous studies and advancements in archaeological methods, we have made great strides in understanding these cultures. Their worldview was drastically different from that of the Old World, as was the case with many New World civilizations, and migration caused by environmental and climatic shifts was a common response, much like in Mesoamerican societies. Archaeologists now have a rich collection of artifacts, products, and housing structures left behind by Athabascan-speaking peoples, and our modern knowledge of their culture has grown largely because of this increased exposure and interest. Most Apache families consisted of several generations living together, similar to many Asian households. One notable difference with the Western Apache was that, unlike many other tribes, they traced their genealogy through the maternal line rather than the paternal. A daughter and her husband-to-be would often live next door to her parents, a tradition that only a few other tribes did not follow. Each summer, the tribespeople would peel back the roofing on their teepee homes, and in addition to hunting, gathering, and cultivating their food, they traded with neighboring tribes. They also had the option of raiding for food and clothing, with much of their attire crafted from beautifully embroidered animal skins. There would inevitably be a chief at the head of each extended family's hierarchy. Within the Apache tribe, groups often clashed and even went to war with one another, reflecting their unconventional view of what it meant to belong to a tribe. Although they had long lived a life of constant warfare, their existence would soon be jeopardized as a new foreign power invaded their territory. With the beginning of their maritime exploits, the Spaniards were establishing themselves on the new continent. In the 16th century, the Apache were first encountered by the Spanish, and it wasn't until the Coronado expedition of 1540 that relations between the two groups truly began to sour. When the Spanish colonizers founded the town of Santa Fe in 1610, tensions were already simmering. At first, the Apache had a fruitful trading relationship with the Pueblo people when they arrived in the Southwest. The Puebloans were the first in the region to build permanent homes and structures, and while the Spanish later established their own pueblos in Arizona and New Mexico, the Apache remained distinct from these more settled communities. Though not complete nomads, the Apache built their characteristic homes in less than 3 days and were among the first indigenous peoples to adopt the use of horses, enabling them to embrace an even more mobile way of life. Despite their obvious differences, the Apache and Pueblo peoples got along remarkably well. However, Spanish colonizers, driven by their own ambitions, began to sow discord among the indigenous communities. After migrating into northern Mexico and Texas, certain eastern tribes conspired with Europeans, and the Spanish took advantage of their lack of resources, often enslaving them. Relations between native communities and European settlers could be friendly in some cases and hostile in others, depending on the circumstances. As Christianity spread across Europe, the Apaches' hopes of forging lasting alliances with the Spanish, Mexicans, and later the Americans ultimately faltered. In the 17th century, during a devastating drought, the Spanish proved unable to defend Pueblo towns against Apache raids. Despite the missionaries' efforts to maintain their influence, a 5-year drought and the rising threat of attacks shook the settlers' faith in their religion. This breakdown contributed to the Pueblo Rebellion of 1680, a pivotal uprising in which several Pueblos found solace and strength in alliances with the Navajo people. For some time, tensions between the Apache and the Spanish simmered. Missionaries continued their outreach efforts, naively believing they could befriend all indigenous groups at once. But this approach proved unrealistic. Aligning with one tribe often meant alienating another, as rivalries ran deep. Spanish missions like Santa Cruz de San Saba and San Lorenzo de la Santa Cruz suffered repeated attacks and conflicts throughout the 18th century. Meanwhile, tensions between the United States and Mexico were rising in the 1840s after Mexico declared its independence in 1821. The Mexican-American War erupted in 1846 after the United States annexed Texas, which Mexico still considered its territory. While Texans saw themselves as an autonomous republic, Mexicans viewed their actions as a rebellion against their authority. To ensure U.S. forces could move freely through their land after the conflict with Mexico, the Apache chose to ally with the United States. However, the Americans lacked the diplomatic finesse of the Spanish. They skipped the subtlety and quickly moved to assert their dominance over the region. With Mexico's defeat, tensions ran high, particularly due to the fragile peace between the Apache and the U.S. This tension ultimately sparked the Apache Wars in the 1850s, driven by the anger of American settlers who had come to the area seeking gold. American gold miners and settlers clashed with the Apache in a series of skirmishes known as the Apache Wars. The settlers' mines, ranches, and cattle symbolized their growing presence in the region. Despite the fact that the Apache leadership and the government had already reached agreements, settlers continued to push forward, encroaching on Apache lands. Though some Apache tribes still harbored animosity toward each other, the majority were initially peaceful with the settlers. However, as the settlers began to expand their territory, raid groups from the Apache started targeting them. When Cochise, a prominent Apache leader, faced false accusations of kidnapping a boy, tensions escalated. The settlers kidnapped Cochise and his companions as a result of this accusation, further intensifying the situation. In response, the Apache tribes encircled the Americans, and when the settlers refused to release their prisoners, the Apache took matters into their own hands, resulting in the deaths of several Americans. In retaliation, the U.S. launched search and destroy missions in 1849, marking the official beginning of the conflict. The Apache, who knew the land well, were outmatched by the Americans' superior weaponry and tactics. The U.S. military's modern strategies and weaponry proved overwhelming for the indigenous Apache people. In 1886, the final blow to the Apache resistance came when U.S. forces forced Chief Geronimo to surrender. However, Geronimo was more than just a legendary figure in American folklore. He was a proud Apache leader, revered by his people, and a symbol of resistance against the encroachment of Western civilization. As one of the most influential Apache leaders, Geronimo led several of the last major uprisings against the growing dominance of the U.S. government. Both his allies and his enemies respected his relentless determination. By 1863, the Navajo people had given up their resistance, and by the early 1870s, other tribes followed suit. Though some Apache continued to raid after this, they did so in an effort to preserve their way of life. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, U.S. government programs aimed at assimilating indigenous peoples began to take hold, leading many Apache families to settle in Mexico and parts of the U.S. today. The states with the largest Apache populations are New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Oklahoma. If you enjoyed this video, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe and give it a like.